The truth about hygiene during the Industrial Revolution period is something most history books will never fully tell you. They will mention the factories, the smoke, the steam engines that changed the world. But they will not tell you what it smelled like. They will not tell you what it felt like to live in a city where the rivers ran black, where families of 12 shared a single room with no running water, and where the very air you breathed could kill you before your 30th birthday. The truth about hygiene during the Industrial Revolution period is not just a chapter in a textbook. It is a story of survival, of forgotten people, and of a darkness that hid beneath the greatest leap of progress humanity had ever seen. In the winter of 1842, in the sprawling industrial heart of Manchester, England, a young woman named Eleanor Cartwright stood at the doorway of a narrow tenement building on Angel Meadow, one of the most notorious slums in the British Empire. She was 23 years old, though the lines around her eyes and the roughness of her hands made her look a decade older. Eleanor had come to Manchester from a small village in Shropshire 3 years earlier, chasing the same dream that had lured hundreds of thousands of rural families into the industrial cities, the promise of steady wages and a better life. What she had found instead was something no one had warned her about. The building she lived in had been constructed hastily, like most of the worker housing in Manchester. It stood 4 stories tall, with walls so thin you could hear every cough, every argument, every cry from every room on every floor. There was no plumbing. There was no sewage system connected to the building. At the back of the narrow alley behind the tenement, a single privy pit served over 60 residents. It was emptied, in theory, once every several months, but in practice it often overflowed long before the night soil collectors came. The stench was something Eleanor had never gotten used to. It clung to her clothes, her hair, her skin. It followed her to the cotton mill where she worked 14 hours a day, 6 days a week. Eleanor shared her room on the 3rd floor with her husband Thomas, their 2 small children, and Thomas's elderly mother, Margaret. The room measured roughly 10 feet by 12 feet. There was one window which they kept shut most of the time because the air outside was often worse than the air inside. The factories that surrounded Angel Meadow belched coal smoke day and night, and on still mornings a thick yellow fog would settle over the neighborhood, burning the eyes and throat of anyone who ventured outside. Washing was a luxury. Water had to be carried from a communal pump 3 streets away, and the pump itself drew from a well that sat dangerously close to several overflowing cesspits. The water often had a yellowish tint and a faint, sour taste that Eleanor tried not to think about. She bathed her children once a week if she could manage it, heating a small pot of water over the coal fire and scrubbing them with a rough cloth. A full bath for herself was something that happened perhaps once a month. Soap was expensive, and the cheap tallow soap sold at the corner shop left a greasy film on the skin that attracted more dirt than it removed. Thomas, who worked in the dye works near the River Irwell, came home every evening with his arms stained deep blue and red up to the elbows. The chemicals in the dyes cracked his skin and left sores that never fully healed. He washed his hands and forearms in a bucket of cold water each night, but the stains remained, seeping into the crevices of his knuckles like permanent tattoos of his labor. Margaret, Thomas's mother, had developed a persistent cough shortly after arriving in Manchester. It had started as a dry, scratchy irritation in her throat, but over the months it had deepened into something wet and rattling, something that shook her thin frame and left flecks of dark mucus on the rag she pressed to her mouth. Eleanor watched her mother-in-law with growing dread. She had seen that cough before, in other residents of Angel Meadow. She knew where it led. The streets outside their tenement were unpaved. In dry weather, they were choked with dust and ash from the factories. In wet weather, which was most of the time in Manchester, they turned into rivers of mud mixed with animal waste, rotting vegetable matter, and the contents of chamber pots that were routinely emptied from upper-story windows with nothing more than a shouted warning. Children played in these streets. They had nowhere else to go. Eleanor's eldest, a boy of 4 named William, had already survived one bout of severe diarrhea that had left him gaunt and listless for weeks. The doctor, when Eleanor had finally scraped together enough coins to consult one, had told her it was likely caused by contaminated water. He had advised her to boil the water before drinking it. Eleanor had nodded, but she knew that coal cost money, and boiling water for every drink and every meal was a cost they could barely afford. This was the reality that the gleaming machines and the soaring profits of the Industrial Revolution had built. For every factory owner who dined on fine china in a Georgian townhouse in the better parts of the city, there were hundreds of Eleanors, hundreds of Thomases, hundreds of Margarets, living in conditions that would have shocked a medieval peasant. The revolution had transformed the economy, but it had not transformed the basic infrastructure of human survival. The cities had grown too fast, swallowed too many people, and no one in power had thought to ask where all those people would sleep, or how they would wash, or what they would do with their waste. And in the winter of 1842, as a new wave of typhus crept through the overcrowded courts and alleys of Angel Meadow, Eleanor Cartwright was about to discover just how thin the line between survival and catastrophe truly was. Check if you are already subscribed to this channel, because the stories told here reveal the hidden truths of history that shape the world you live in today, and you do not want to miss a single one. The typhus arrived in Angel Meadow the way most diseases did, quietly, invisibly, carried on the bodies of lice that thrived in the unwashed clothes and matted hair of the desperately poor. The first case Eleanor heard about was a woman 2 floors below her, a widow named Mrs. Brennan, who had collapsed at her loom in the cotton mill and been carried home by 2 of her fellow workers. Within 3 days, Mrs. Brennan was dead. Within a week, her 3 children were showing symptoms: the terrible headache, the high fever, the rash that spread across the chest and arms like a dark stain. Eleanor tried to keep her family away from the lower floors. She told William not to play with the Brennan children, not to go near their door. But in a building where 60 people shared a single staircase, a single privy and a single water pump, isolation was impossible. The lice did not respect closed doors. They traveled on shared blankets, on the wooden benches where the women sat to mend clothes, on the very walls of the narrow corridors. Thomas came home one evening in late January with a look on his face that Eleanor had never seen before. He sat down on the edge of their straw mattress and told her that the dye works had been shut down, not because of the typhus, but because the River Irwell had become so polluted that the water could no longer be used in the dyeing process. The factories upstream had been dumping chemical waste directly into the river for years, and the water had turned into a thick, foul-smelling sludge that ruined any fabric it touched. Thomas was out of work, effective immediately. Eleanor felt the ground shift beneath her. Without Thomas's wages, they could not pay rent. Without rent, they would be on the street. And on the streets of Manchester in January. With typhus spreading through the slums, being homeless was very close to being dead. She went to the mill the next morning and asked the foreman if there was any extra work available. The foreman, a thick-necked man named Hargreaves, looked her up and down with an expression that made her skin crawl. He told her there was work in the carding room, where the raw cotton was combed and prepared for spinning. The carding room was the most dangerous part of the mill. The air was thick with cotton dust that settled in the lungs, and over time caused a condition the workers called mill fever, a slow suffocation that could take years to kill, but that began its work from the very first breath. Eleanor knew this. Every worker in the mill knew this, but she also knew that her children needed to eat. She started in the carding room the following day. The noise was deafening. The machines rattled and roared, and the air was so thick with floating fibers that she could barely see the woman working beside her. By the end of her first shift, she was coughing. By the end of her first week, she could taste cotton in the back of her throat every morning when she woke. Meanwhile, Margaret's cough had worsened. She was now spending most of the day in bed, too weak to stand for more than a few minutes. Eleanor had tried every home remedy she knew: hot compresses on the chest, steam inhalation over a pot of boiling water with dried herbs, a spoonful of treacle mixed with vinegar that an old woman in the building had sworn by. Nothing helped. The cough was relentless, and Margaret was growing thinner by the day, her cheekbones sharp beneath paper-thin skin. One evening, as Eleanor was boiling their meager supper of potatoes and cabbage, she heard a commotion in the street below. She went to the window and looked down. A group of men in dark coats were moving through Angel Meadow, accompanied by 2 constables. They were inspecting the tenement buildings, knocking on doors, asking questions. Eleanor would later learn that they were members of a sanitary commission that had been formed in response to the typhus outbreak. They were led by a young doctor named James Hartley, a man of 28, who had recently read a report by Edwin Chadwick on the sanitary conditions of the working class, and who had been so horrified by its findings that he had volunteered to conduct inspections in the worst slums of Manchester. When Dr. Hartley knocked on Eleanor's door, she opened it reluctantly. She was ashamed of the room, of the stained walls, of the bucket in the corner that served as their nighttime chamber pot, of Margaret's haggard figure lying on the mattress in the corner. But Dr. Hartley did not look at her with disgust. He looked at her with something closer to grief. He examined Margaret gently, listening to her chest with a wooden stethoscope, and told Eleanor that her mother-in-law had consumption, what would later be known as tuberculosis. He said it plainly, without false hope, and Eleanor respected him for that, even as the words landed like a blow to her stomach. "The conditions here," Dr. Hartley said quietly, looking around the room, "these conditions are what make people sick. It is not weakness. It is not God's punishment. It is filth, overcrowding, and contaminated water. And it can be changed." Eleanor looked at him. She wanted to believe him. But she had lived in Angel Meadow for 3 years, and nothing had ever changed. If this story is making you think about the realities hidden behind the pages of history, drop a comment below and tell me. I want to hear your thoughts. Dr. Hartley left that evening, but his words stayed with Eleanor. They lodged in her mind like a seed in cracked earth, and over the weeks that followed, something began to grow. Not hope exactly, but something harder and more stubborn, a refusal to accept that this was all there could ever be. Thomas, meanwhile, had found temporary work as a night soil collector, one of the lowest and most despised jobs in the city. Every night, he descended into the cesspits and privy vaults of the wealthier neighborhoods, shoveling human waste into barrels that were carted to the edge of the city and dumped. The work was revolting. The smell permeated everything. Thomas would come home before dawn, strip off his soiled clothes in the alley, and pour bucket after bucket of cold water over himself, scrubbing his skin until it was raw. But the smell never fully left him. It seeped into his pores, into his hair, into the very fiber of his being. Other workers shunned him. Even in Angel Meadow, where everyone lived in filth, the night soil collectors were treated as untouchables. Eleanor watched her husband shrink under the weight of this shame. The man who had once told her stories by the fire in their Shropshire cottage, who had made her laugh with his impressions of the village parson, was disappearing. In his place was a silent, hollow-eyed stranger who flinched when his own children reached for him. Spring came to Manchester in 1843, though you would hardly have known it in Angel Meadow. The days grew longer, but the smoke from the factories still blotted out the sun most mornings, and the streets remained rivers of mud and waste. Margaret died on a Tuesday in April, quietly, in her sleep, her lungs finally surrendering to the disease that had been consuming her for months. Eleanor washed her mother-in-law's body with the last of their clean water, dressed her in her only good dress, and sat with her until the undertaker came. There was no money for a proper funeral. Margaret was buried in a mass grave at the edge of the city, along with dozens of other paupers who had died that week. Eleanor stood at the edge of the pit and watched as the gravediggers shoveled lime over the bodies to mask the smell and slow the spread of disease. She did not cry. She had used up her tears long ago. Thomas took his mother's death hard. He stopped speaking almost entirely, going through the motions of his nightly work like a man moving through a dream. Eleanor was afraid for him, afraid that the grief and the shame and the relentless exhaustion would break something inside him that could not be repaired. She tried to reach him, sitting beside him in the grey morning light after his shifts, placing her hand on his arm, talking to him about small things. What William had said that day, how the baby had smiled. Sometimes Thomas responded with a nod or a faint press of his hand against hers. Most times he simply stared at the wall. It was during this period that Eleanor encountered Dr. Hartley again. He had returned to Angel Meadow as part of a larger effort to document the conditions of the slums for a parliamentary report. He was thinner than she remembered, and there were dark circles under his eyes. The work was taking its toll on him too. When he saw Eleanor, he recognized her immediately and asked about Margaret. Eleanor told him, her voice flat and steady. Dr. Hartley closed his eyes for a moment, then opened them and said something that changed the course of Eleanor's life. "There is a meeting," he said. "A group of working people, men and women both, who are organizing to demand better sanitation, clean water, proper sewers, regular waste removal. They meet every Thursday evening at the Mechanics Institute on Cooper Street. I think you should come." Eleanor almost laughed. She worked 14 hours a day in a carding room that was slowly poisoning her lungs. She had 2 small children to feed and a husband who was barely holding on. The idea that she had time to attend meetings about sewers seemed absurd, but something in Dr. Hartley's earnest, exhausted face stopped her from refusing outright. She told him she would think about it. She thought about it for exactly 2 days. On Thursday evening, after putting the children to bed and leaving Thomas asleep on the mattress, she walked the 20 minutes to Cooper Street and climbed the stairs to the meeting room above the Mechanics Institute. The room was small and poorly lit, crowded with about 30 men and women, who looked as worn and threadbare as she did. At the front of the room, a man named Robert Ashworth was speaking. He was a former mill worker who had lost 3 fingers to a spinning machine and now devoted his time to advocating for working-class reforms. He spoke plainly, without ornament, about the connection between filth and disease, about the thousands of preventable deaths that occurred every year in Manchester's slums, about the criminal negligence of the city authorities who collected taxes from the poor but provided nothing in return. No clean water, no sewers, no paved roads, no refuse collection. Eleanor listened, and for the first time in years, the fog of exhaustion and resignation that had settled over her began to thin. She recognized everything Ashworth described. She had lived it, breathed it, lost her mother-in-law to it, but hearing it spoken aloud, hearing it named as something that could be fought, something that was not inevitable, that was new. If this story is touching something deep inside you, write in the comments right now. Everyone deserves clean water. Let this message travel far, because some truths need to be heard. She began attending the meetings every week. At first, she only listened, but gradually, as she grew more comfortable, she began to speak. She told the group about the water pump near Angel Meadow, about the yellowish water that tasted of rot, about the cesspits that overflowed into the very ground from which the well drew. She described Margaret's death, the carding room, the night soil work that was destroying her husband's spirit. She spoke with a quiet intensity that commanded attention, and the group began to look to her as one of their most compelling voices. Eleanor started going door to door in Angel Meadow, talking to her neighbors, collecting their stories, documenting the conditions in which they lived. She wrote letters, painstakingly in a careful hand she had learned at the village school in Shropshire, to the local board of health, to the factory inspectors, to anyone who might listen. Most of her letters went unanswered. Some were returned unopened, but she kept writing. Thomas noticed the change in his wife. At first, he was skeptical. He had seen too many promises broken, too many reformers who talked loudly and achieved nothing. But Eleanor's determination was infectious. She did not promise that things would change quickly. She did not promise that they would change at all. She simply said that doing nothing was no longer something she could live with. Slowly, reluctantly, Thomas began to help. He used his knowledge of the cesspit system, knowledge gained through months of degrading, backbreaking labor, to map the waste infrastructure of Angel Meadow and the surrounding neighborhoods. He showed how the cesspits leached into the water table, how the wells from which thousands of people drank were poisoned at their source. His maps, crude but detailed, became one of the most powerful pieces of evidence the reform group possessed. The summer of 1843 brought cholera to Manchester. It came as it always came, through contaminated water, and it struck the poorest neighborhoods first and hardest. Angel Meadow was devastated. Within 6 weeks, over 200 people in the immediate area had died, their bodies racked by the violent dehydration that was cholera's signature cruelty. The disease did not discriminate by age or strength. It killed infants and grown men with equal efficiency, reducing them from healthy to dead in as little as 12 hours. Eleanor's son William fell ill on a sweltering day in July. The symptoms came on suddenly: the watery diarrhea, the violent vomiting, the terrible thirst that could not be quenched. Eleanor held him through the night, forcing small sips of boiled water past his cracked lips, wrapping him in damp cloths to fight the fever. Thomas sat beside them, his face a mask of terror, his hands clenched so tightly that his nails drew blood from his palms. They had already lost Margaret. The thought of losing William was more than either of them could bear. Dr. Hartley came at dawn. He had been working without sleep for 3 days, moving from house to house through the cholera-stricken streets, doing what little he could with the limited medicine available. He examined William and told Eleanor and Thomas the truth. The boy was severely dehydrated, and without proper treatment his chances were not good. But he also told them that if they could keep fluids in him, keep him cool, and keep fighting, there was a chance. It was a slim chance, but it was a chance. For 3 days and 3 nights, Eleanor and Thomas took turns holding their son, dripping boiled water mixed with a pinch of salt and sugar into his mouth, changing his soiled clothes, praying to whatever force might be listening. On the 4th morning, William's fever broke. His eyes, which had been glassy and unfocused for days, cleared. He looked up at his mother and whispered that he was hungry. Eleanor pressed her face against his small, damp forehead and felt something crack open inside her chest, a release of terror so profound that her entire body shook. William survived. Many others did not. By the time the cholera epidemic faded in the autumn, over 1,000 people in Manchester had died. The newspapers carried the story, and for a brief moment, the comfortable classes of England were forced to confront what they had spent years ignoring, that the conditions in the industrial slums were not merely unfortunate, but deadly, not merely regrettable, but criminal. The reform group seized the moment. Robert Ashworth and Eleanor Cartwright, along with Dr. Hartley and a dozen other committed activists, presented their evidence to a parliamentary committee in London. Eleanor's letters, Thomas's maps, Dr. Hartley's medical records, all of it was laid before the committee members, many of whom had never set foot in a working-class neighborhood in their lives. The testimony was detailed, damning, and impossible to dismiss. Change did not come overnight. It never does. But in the years that followed, the pressure from reformers like Eleanor, combined with the undeniable evidence of the cholera epidemics, led to the passage of the Public Health Act of 1848, one of the first pieces of legislation in British history to mandate basic sanitation standards. It was imperfect, poorly enforced, and woefully insufficient. But it was a beginning. It established the principle that the government had a responsibility to protect the health of its citizens, that clean water and proper sewage were not luxuries, but necessities, and that the lives of the poor were worth protecting. Eleanor continued her work for many years after that. She never became famous. Her name does not appear in most history books. She remained a working-class woman in a society that valued working-class women very little. But in Angel Meadow and in the neighborhood surrounding it, people knew her name. They knew her as the woman who had refused to accept that filth and disease were simply the price of progress. They knew her as the woman who had written letters when no one was listening, who had knocked on doors when no one was answering, who had stood before powerful men and told them the truth about what their wealth was built upon. Thomas eventually left the night soil work. As the sanitation reform slowly took effect and proper sewer systems began to be constructed, the cesspits that had defined his labor and his shame were gradually sealed and replaced. He found work as a bricklayer, helping to build the very infrastructure that his maps had helped to advocate for. It was honest, dignified work, and it gave him back something that the cesspits had taken, his sense of himself as a man worthy of respect. William grew up strong, though he carried the marks of his childhood illness for the rest of his life. He never forgot the night his parents held him through the cholera, never forgot the taste of the salt and sugar water that had kept him alive. When he was old enough, he trained as a plumber, one of the new tradesmen whose work was transforming the cities of England from death traps into livable spaces. He spent his career laying pipes, connecting homes to clean water supplies, building the invisible infrastructure of survival that most people never thought about. The truth about hygiene during the Industrial Revolution is not just a story about dirt and disease. It is a story about what happens when progress outpaces humanity, when profit is valued above people, and when the basic needs of the many are sacrificed for the wealth of the few. It is a story about the invisible labor of survival, the water carried, The waste removed, the bodies washed, the sick tended. Labor performed overwhelmingly by women and by the poorest members of society. And it is a story about the stubborn, unglamorous courage of people like Eleanor Cartwright, who looked at the world as it was and refused to believe it was the world as it had to be. The factories of the Industrial Revolution changed the world forever. They created unimaginable wealth, powered an empire, and laid the foundations of the modern economy. But beneath the smoke and the steam, in the cramped rooms and the reeking alleys, ordinary people paid the price in their health, their dignity, and their lives. Their story is not a footnote to progress. It is the story of progress itself, the full, uncomfortable, necessary truth that comfort was built on suffering, and that the clean world we live in today was fought for, brick by brick, pipe by pipe, letter by letter, by people whose names we have mostly forgotten, but whose legacy we carry in every glass of clean water we drink. If you watched until this very end, it is because this story meant something to you. Hit the like button if this moved you, and share it with someone who needs to hear it, because the stories of these forgotten people deserve to be told. Make sure you are subscribed to this channel so you never miss stories that reveal the raw, hidden truths of history. And if you truly made it all the way here, leave a comment saying, "I watched until the end," so I can know who you are and who truly appreciates the stories on this channel.